Welcome back into Live Now from Fox, taking a live look there at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. on this Saturday, as we do want to tackle some of the biggest headlines from this week politically. A few days ago, House Republicans were able to pass President Trump's big, beautiful bill, which is a tax and immigration package. That was passed by a single vote, but still, there's a lot more that needs to happen, mainly the fact that it's going to be heading to the Senate next. To break all of this down, joining us here on the program is political analyst and historian Rich Rubino. Rich, good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
All right, so by one vote, this passed through the House, and it was so many days, so many hours, late into the night, overnight. We were watching as they continued to debate several issues and several key components of this bill. But let's talk about the Senate. Where do senators stand with this bill?
Well, it's interesting. So the United States Senate, they really only have 3 votes to spare in the Republican caucus, assuming, which is, I think is pretty much assured, that not a solitary Democrat will vote for the package. So that means that essentially Republicans like John Hosted from Ohio, who might have potentially have a challenge with former Senator Sherrod Brown this time around, or Senator Susan Collins from Maine, a state that last time around went for Vice President Harris, or Tom Tillis in North Carolina, very much a swing state, are going to have problems if they're to try to justify some of the parts of the bill that are unpopular. So perhaps they have to somehow moderate that on the one hand. On the other hand, in that, though, you have folks like Rand Paul, very much a libertarian from Kentucky, who I think is very much a hard no in the legislation right now because he believes that it's going to explode the deficit. Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, also probably somebody who would be a hard no, potentially very conservative Republican. So it's really going to be a delicate balancing act, and we'll see if John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, has the legislative dexterity that Mike Johnson, as House Speaker, has in trying to kind of corral both wings of the Republican Party to get legislation passed and get it to the president's desk eventually.
Rich, what are some of the key issues and problems that lawmakers have with this bill?
Well, on the right, you have Republicans like Rand Paul, for example, that are very much deficit hawks that look at some of the studies that show this potentially could add up to $4 trillion to the national debt. So that's one side. That's on the one hand. On the other side, you have some people who are very much opposed, and some in the Republican Party who I think are kind of skeptical right now about the potential for Medicaid cuts. The Republicans will say that this is simply work requirements for able-bodied adults. But I think that some Republicans might, at least some moderate Republicans, might potentially have pressure in their states. Some protesters who say this is cuts to Medicaid, cuts to SNAP, food stamp benefits. So they're really kind of it's very much a very delicate balancing act for the Republican Party because you have the opposition on the right, opposition on the left. And Mike Johnson was able to corral both the right and the left, everyone from the Republicans and the more moderate Republicans who represent districts that voted for Harris last times, like Don Bacon from Nebraska, Mike Lawler from New York, Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, but also the most conservative members. And he really only had three to spare. He had 2 Republicans who voted against it because they thought that it would explode the deficit, and then he had one who voted present. But he was able to get both the Freedom Caucus and the more progressive members together and to vote for the proposed legislation.
Before that bill went into the House floor for a vote, we saw President Trump make a stop on Capitol Hill, meeting with several other GOP leaders. How common is that for us to see a president go into Capitol Hill and lobby directly with these lawmakers to get some of this legislation passed? And could we see something similar when it comes to the Senate side?
Yeah, it's very rare for a president actually to go himself. Usually the president uses the telephone, and which he did that as well, and will call up wayward members and say, what can I do to get this legislation passed? But Donald Trump actually went there himself. By the way, they have legislative teams that are up there usually lobbying on Capitol Hill on the behalf of the president. But I think Donald Trump sees himself as kind of the great finisher, if you will, to try to get the legislation passed. I think you probably will see him going up to the United States Senate to try to use his influence. He's very popular within the Republican Party, and I think he would try to make the case that, at least for the more conservative members, that potentially that this is not going to necessarily explode the deficit and you need to vote for this. On the other side, I think that some of the more moderate members like Tom Tillis or Susan Collins, I think he could warn them potentially that if they vote against the legislation, that he may support a primary challenger against them. So I think that he really has a delicate balancing act as well.
As I mentioned before, we saw some of these lawmakers spending long hours overnight. I mean, going all night into the day, continuing on for several days as they debated some of the components of this bill. Did we see any changes being made to that entire package before it headed over to the House for that vote?
I think that in terms of going over to the Senate, I think there was what's called, it's very complicated, but called the SALT deductions, which are involving taxes, which disproportionately disbenefit some of the more northern states. Folks like Mike Lawler, I mentioned from New York, very much wanted to reform the SALT system. They got that. And then I think that just in terms of Donald Trump himself trying to personally lobby, he was trying to make the case to the Republicans that that he would perhaps make the requirements for work requirements for Medicaid. He would make them faster than potentially 2028. They would potentially start in 2026, and that's how he got some of those hesitant or incredulous Republicans like Chip Roy of Texas, for example, to vote for the proposed legislation.
This entire the tax package, excuse me, it's quite lengthy. It's over a
Yes.
thousand pages. Rich, is it possible to break it down to, the average viewer that wants to understand what's in this, but is not necessarily going to read the entire thousand plus pages? I mean, what would you say are the most important takeaways?
Yes, and I think it certainly will not be something you'll see at the local supermarket at the front desk. The main takeaways I think are that Donald Trump, in terms of, so what is fortifying, what is boosting spending? I think you'll see that border security. You'll see that with the military, with national defense. Those are the programs that are going to get more money. The 2017 tax cuts that Donald Trump signed, they will be renewed. On the other side of that, you will see the work requirements for able-bodied adults involving Medicaid, and you'll see some cuts certainly to the SNAP benefit. Donald Trump would say that he wants to reform it. I think when it comes to Medicaid, he will say that he wants to simply reform it. I think you're going to see a lot of Democrats running in 2026, and they're going to say that the Republican voted to cut Medicare. You're going to see a lot of protests, particularly at members of the House when if they do town hall meetings, particularly the more moderate members. People saying that you cut Medicare, you cut Medicaid, you cut food stamps potentially. I think that Donald Trump, for his populist appeal and what's very popular, is there's going to be no tax on overtime temporarily, no tax on tips temporarily. So that's something that I think Donald Trump can go to, and can go to his Republican, some of his more populist base, as opposed to the conservative libertarian base, and say, I got this for you. But I do think that the Democrats see this as potentially politically advantageous to them, and they're going to run against it the way that the Republicans really ran against, for example, Bill Clinton's Budget Discretionary Act in 1993 and took back the House for the first time. For the first time in 40 years, or the way the Democrats ran in 2006 against George W. Bush's proposals to partially privatize Social Security. So it's very much perilous, I think, for Republicans. But obviously, it depends on how you spin it, and and the way that you spin it, and which programs you try to, part of the bills you try to emphasize. But obviously, this is going to be a major flagship issue in the 2026 midterm elections.
Rich, I always like to ask you a little bit of a history question whenever I have you on the program, because I mean that's what you got up there. It's all of these wild political historical facts. In terms of when you mentioned before, it's very rare to see a president go down there on Capitol Hill to lobby directly for a bill because they have people in place to do that.
Yes.
Anything else that stuck out to you, given this whole process, or even how involved the president is with it?
Yes, it reminded me a little bit of, say, Lyndon Johnson when he would try to get his Great Society programs down. He would really kind of harangue sometimes the members of Congress who would say, "I'll give you this, I'll give you that." Other members certainly who have had a legislative experience. Gerald Ford had 25 years in the House, and then became minority leader. He was able to sometimes call leaders of his own party, sometimes leaders of the other party, and they would have kind of jovial discussions. I think Donald Trump, though, I think his basic style is sometimes to kind of threaten the lawmakers. From what I've heard, he's called up and he's kind of really excoriated the lawmakers and say, "How dare you not vote for this legislation?" He's really tried to make them fear him. And it's interesting because is Donald Trump is not popular generally in the country. He has job approval ratings under 50%, but within the Republican Party, he is extremely popular. And I think that he could potentially use a couple of threats. And one of the main threats that he can use for these lawmakers is say, if you vote against this legislation, whether it's somebody on the left or it's somebody on the right, I will support a primary challenger against you. And Donald Trump usually, generally speaking, presidents, with some exceptions like Franklin Roosevelt in 1938, Woodrow Wilson in 1918, presidents almost ecumenically or universally, if you will, support candidates in their own party, even if they disagree with them on certain pieces of legislation. Donald Trump is an outlier here. He has supported in the past primary opponents. He's even suggested, for example, John Thune during his first administration, the Senate Majority Leader, when he was before he was the Senate Majority Leader, he suggested that Christine Noem, who was the governor of South Dakota at the time, challenge him in a primary because John Thune was being somewhat recreant or unfaithful to his to Donald Trump's ideology. So I think that Donald Trump's basic strategy is really to threaten that person, but he really has a vice grip, if you will, on the Republican Party like nobody, I think, has had since Lyndon Johnson those first 2 years, 64 and 65, on the Democratic Party.
And then finally, Rich, when we talk about next steps, what we could be seeing throughout the next several days, when is the Senate going to pick this up for a vote? How soon could we see it head to the president's desk? Yeah. What's the timeline that we're looking at?
The process usually for getting major legislation like this is usually about 5 months. Donald Trump says he wants it by July 4th. I think it'll probably go after that. It'll probably go later. Or basically, it's almost like we're starting anew. The House has passed their piece of legislation, then the Senate has to pass their piece of legislation, and then it goes, and then they kind of reconcile the two pieces of legislation. But it really is a very messy process in terms of politics, in terms of how a major piece of legislation comes out like this. And we'll see, I think, in terms of how different or how divergent, if you will, the House piece of legislation is from the Senate piece of legislation. But Donald Trump obviously is looking for a win, and there probably will be some concessions that he was going to have to make, but then he will certainly declare victory at some point if he can get this legislation through. But again, watch those 3 members of the United States Senate. Watch Susan Collins. She's in the state of Maine, which is Democratic leaning. Watch Tom Tillis from North Carolina. North Carolina is very much a swing state. They're both up for re-election. Watch John Husted from Ohio. Ohio is a more of a Republican state, but if the Democrats can get a top recruit to run against him, like former Senator Sherrod Brown, then and it's a very much of a populist state, he's potentially somebody that Donald Trump might really have to beseech to vote for the piece of legislation.
All right. What I got from that is we have a long way to go. Rich Rubino.
Categorically.
Oh, man. Political analyst and historian. Always good to have you here on the program. Thanks so much. And we'll be talking soon.
Thank you so much for having me on again.
Of course.